A man steps through the entrance of an upscale restaurant. The golden glow of chandeliers reflects off his expensive suit. His shoes shine, his watch glistens. Every step he takes exudes confidence, entitlement. He is used to being the most important person in the room. His name is Richard, a self-made millionaire, or so he tells people. He believes his wealth makes him superior. He moves through the restaurant like he owns it, head held high, scanning the room. Other diners glance at him, some recognizing his face from magazines, others simply impressed by his aura of importance. Then his eyes land on her. A young black woman sits alone at a small table near the window. She isn't wearing designer clothes. No flashy jewelry, no expensive handbag. Just a simple blouse, neatly pressed, and dark jeans. A book rests in her hands, her fingers lightly turning the pages as she reads. Richard stops. His lips curl into a sneer. What is she doing here? This restaurant is exclusive. The kind of place where reservations are made months in advance. The kind of place where wealth isn't just expected, it's required. She doesn't look the part, she doesn't belong. Richard tilts his head, watching her. He assumes she must be lost, maybe waiting for someone else. Maybe a mistake was made at the door. He chuckles under his breath. For a moment he debates ignoring her, but the thought lingers. The idea that someone like her is sitting here, in his space, irritates him. With a smirk he steps toward her table. This is going to be fun. Richard strides toward the table, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. His smirk widens as he stops just beside her, tilting his head slightly as if inspecting something odd, something out of place. He lets out a dramatic sigh, loud enough for the tables around them to hear. Well, well, he says, shaking his head. Looks like someone took a wrong turn. The woman doesn't look up. She continues reading, flipping to the next page as if he isn't even there. Richard's smirk falters for a fraction of a second. He's not used to being ignored. He places a hand on the back of the empty chair across from her and leans in slightly. This restaurant has a certain standard, he says, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You sure you're in the right place? A few nearby customers glance over. Some smirk, amused. Others shift uncomfortably in their seats. The waitstaff, dressed in crisp uniforms, exchange nervous looks but say nothing. The woman remains silent, her eyes scanning the lines of her book. Her posture is relaxed, unfazed. Richard scoffs. He can't believe she isn't reacting. Most people would be flustered, embarrassed, maybe even apologetic. He glances at her outfit, eyes narrowing at the simplicity of her clothes. Then he lets out a small laugh, shaking his head as if the situation is just too ridiculous. Tell me, he says, tapping a finger on the table. Did you get lost on your way to, I don't know, a coffee shop or something? No response. His smirk tightens. His voice gets louder. Or maybe you're just waiting for someone who actually belongs here? A few chuckles ripple through the room. The tension thickens. Some diners look away, pretending not to hear. Others watch, eager to see what happens next. Still, the woman doesn't react. Richard exhales sharply, frustration flickering in his eyes. He straightens up and crosses his arms. Look, I'm just trying to help you out, he continues, feigning concern. This place isn't cheap, you know. I mean, just one appetizer costs more than... He pauses, scanning her up and down before chuckling. Your entire outfit. A couple at a nearby table exchange glances. A waiter standing a few feet away shifts uncomfortably, gripping his notepad. Another waitress bites her lip, clearly debating whether to step in. The woman calmly turns another page in her book. Richard narrows his eyes. His amusement is starting to fade, replaced by irritation. What are you reading anyway? He scoffs. A guide on how to dress for fancy restaurants? Or maybe something about how to marry rich? More laughter. A few gasps. Richard smirks, satisfied. That one had to get a reaction. But the woman just exhales softly, as if mildly inconvenienced by a mosquito buzzing nearby. Richard's jaw clenches. He isn't used to being ignored. He isn't used to his insults falling flat. He takes a step closer. "You're really not going to say anything?" he asks, voice lower now. "Nothing? Not even a thank you for the free advice?" The woman finally moves. Slowly, gracefully, she reaches for the glass of water in front of her, takes a sip, and sets it back down. Then she folds the corner of her page, closes her book, and looks up at him for the first time. Her expression is unreadable. Calm. Unbothered. But something in her eyes makes Richard pause. For the first time since he walked over, he feels unsure, and then she speaks. "I was waiting to see how far you'd go." Her voice is soft but firm, measured. It isn't angry. It isn't shaken. It's controlled. Richard frowns, caught off guard. The restaurant is silent now. Everyone is watching. The woman closes her book with deliberate care, placing it gently on the table. Her fingers rest on the cover for a moment before she looks up. Her eyes meet Richard's, calm, steady, unshaken. He expected embarrassment, anger maybe, but not this. She tilts her head slightly. "Why do you assume I don't belong here?" Her voice is smooth, unbothered. There is no defensiveness, no fear. Just a simple, direct question. Richard blinks. He wasn't expecting a conversation. He was expecting submission. A smirk tugs at the corner of his lips, but there's something forced about it now. He lets out a short, dry laugh. "Oh, come on," he scoffs, shaking his head. "Let's not play games. This place isn't exactly your scene." She doesn't react. She just watches him. He shifts slightly, as if needing to fill the silence. "I mean, no offense," he continues, clearly meaning offense. "But this is a very exclusive restaurant. It's for people who have, made something of themselves." His words hang in the air. She studies him, expression unreadable. Then slowly she smiles. "That's interesting," she says softly. Richard frowns. "What's interesting?" She leans back in her chair, her posture completely at ease. "The way you talk. You sound so sure of yourself, like you know everything about me." Richard scoffs. "I don't need to know you. I can see you." She raises an eyebrow. "Oh?" He gestures at her outfit. "It's obvious. You're nobody. You're not one of us." Another silence. This time it feels different. Richard shifts his weight from one foot to the other. He doesn't understand why, but something about this woman is making him uncomfortable. She doesn't argue. She doesn't defend herself. She just looks at him, like she's watching something unfold, waiting for the inevitable. And for some reason, that makes him uneasy. His voice hardens. "Look, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm done with it. Just leave, all right? Go somewhere that's a better fit." She doesn't move. A flicker of frustration flashes across Richard's face. "Did you hear me? I said leave." At that moment, a waiter hesitantly approaches. A young man, probably in his early 20s. His hands are clasped in front of him, and there's an uneasy look in his eyes. Sir?" The waiter says cautiously, glancing between Richard and the woman. Is everything all right?" Richard crosses his arms, exhaling sharply. "I don't know. You tell me. Does it look all right?" The waiter hesitates. He looks at the woman, almost as if searching for her reaction. But she is still completely calm. She meets the waiter's eyes, offering him a polite, reassuring nod. The waiter swallows. He clearly doesn't want to get involved, but the tension is thick in the air. Other customers are watching now, some whispering, others simply observing. Richard gestures toward her. "Listen, I'm just trying to help out here. I mean, I don't want her to be embarrassed when the check comes, you know." A few soft chuckles ripple from a nearby table. The woman simply smiles again. Not in amusement, not in anger, just patience. The waiter shifts uncomfortably. "Sir, Richard waves a dismissive hand. "You know what? Forget it. Just get security or something." The waiter hesitates again, his eyes flicking to the woman once more. She picks up her glass of water and takes a slow sip. Then she sets it down, looking up at Richard, and for the first time, her expression changes. Not much, just a tiny shift, a glint in her eyes, like she's waiting for something, like she already knows what's about to happen. Before the waiter can respond, a voice cuts through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" Richard turns his head, expecting security. Instead, he sees a man in a tailored suit approaching. He moves with quiet authority, his expression unreadable. It's the restaurant manager. Richard crosses his arms, relieved. Finally, someone with authority will handle this. But then, something strange happens. The manager doesn't look at Richard. Instead, he turns to the woman and smiles. A genuine, respectful smile. "Ms. Daniels," he says warmly, "it's so good to see you again." Thought a hush falls over the room. Richard stiffens, his smirk fading. His mind races. "Ms. Daniels?" The woman, Ms. Daniels, looks up, her expression still calm. She nods at the manager. "Good to see you too, Mark." Richard's stomach twists. They know each other? The manager clasps his hands together. "I wasn't expecting you tonight. If I'd known, I would have had your usual table prepared." More whispers ripple through the restaurant. Waiters exchange glances. Nearby diners pretend not to listen, but lean in ever so slightly. Richard forces a chuckle, though it feels tight in his throat. "Wait a minute," he says, looking between them. "You know her?" The manager's expression shifts slightly, as if only now noticing Richard for the first time. His polite smile remains, but there's something cool in his eyes. "Yes," he says simply. Then he turns back to Ms. Daniels. "Would you like me to move you to your preferred spot?" She shakes her head, a soft smile playing on her lips. "No need. I like this seat by the window." The manager nods. "Of course. Let me know if there's anything you need." Richard watches, stunned, as the manager shows her nothing but respect. His mind struggles to process what's happening. She doesn't belong here. He was sure of it. And yet... He clears his throat, trying to regain control. "So, who exactly are you?" he asks, forcing a casual tone, though his curiosity burns. Ms. Daniels turns to him, amusement flickering in her eyes. "Oh, I'm nobody," she says lightly. Richard's jaw clenches. He doesn't like being played with. The manager, however, lets out a small chuckle. "Ms. Daniels is being modest," he says. "She's a well-known author and investor." Richard blinks. Author? Investor? The words don't make sense at first. The manager continues, his voice filled with admiration. "Her latest book made the bestseller list last month, and she's been featured in several business magazines." Richard stares at her. His mind races, trying to recall if he's seen her name before. "An investor?" he repeats slowly. Ms. Daniels nods. "That's right." His throat feels dry. "Investing in... what, exactly?" The manager smiles. "Many things. Real estate, tech, and well, this restaurant chain." The words hit like a brick. Richard feels the room tilt slightly. "What?" Ms. Daniels tilts her head, her expression unreadable. "I own shares in this company," she says simply. "Quite a few, actually." Silence. Richard stares at her, his mind spinning. She's not just some investor. She's not just successful. She partially owns this restaurant. The very one he tried to push her out of. The realization settles heavily in his chest. The whispers around the restaurant grow louder. Other customers murmur, some exchanging knowing glances, others shaking their heads at Richard. Richard swallows. His confidence, once so solid, now feels like sand slipping through his fingers. The woman he insulted, humiliated, treated like she was nothing. She has more power in this room than he does, and she never had to prove it. The manager turns back to Ms. Daniels. I really appreciate you coming tonight. We're honored to have you. Ms. Daniels nods. I always enjoy dining here. Richard remains frozen, his mind replaying the past few minutes. Every smug comment, every insult, every assumption. And now the weight of his mistake is crushing. Richard's face burns. His once confident smirk is gone. The room feels hotter, smaller. The weight of 100 eyes pressing down on him. He opens his mouth, then closes it. His throat is dry. His brain scrambles for something, anything, to regain control. He clears his throat, forcing a weak chuckle. I didn't realize. Ms. Daniels watches him, her expression calm, waiting. Richard exhales sharply, shaking his head as if trying to make sense of it all. But you don't even look rich. The words slip out before he can stop them. A few people gasp. Someone near the bar mutters, Wow. Ms. Daniels raises an eyebrow, amused. Oh? Richard stammers, struggling to explain himself. I mean, I just thought, most people with money show it. She leans back slightly, resting her hands on the table. And what does showing it mean to you? He blinks. Well, then, nice clothes, expensive jewelry, a certain look. Ms. Daniels nods slowly, as if considering his words. Then she smiles, but there's something sharp behind it. Real wealth isn't about showing off, she says simply. It's about building something that lasts. Richard clenches his jaw. She continues, her voice steady. Some people spend money to prove they have it. Others use money to create opportunities, to invest in things that matter, to make a difference. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. She isn't gloating. She isn't angry. She's just stating facts. He glances around the restaurant. Customers are still watching, some whispering behind their hands. A woman near the bar shakes her head. Unbelievable, she mutters. A couple at a nearby table exchange looks, one smirking, the other shaking his head in disbelief. Richard shifts uncomfortably. He's no longer in control of the narrative. He feels humiliated. Ms. Daniels picks up her glass, taking a small sip before continuing. I worked hard for everything I have, she says. I wasn't handed it. I wasn't born into it. I built it. Her voice is calm, but there's strength beneath it, a quiet power that makes Richard feel smaller by the second. She sets the glass down. I didn't need a fancy suit to walk in here. I didn't need a designer bag to prove I could afford the meal. She pauses, then adds, But you? You needed to tear someone down just to feel bigger. Richard flinches. Silence. More whispers. His fingers twitch at his sides. His mind races for something, anything, to salvage his pride. He laughs, too loud, too forced. All right, he mutters, rubbing his jaw. I get it. Lesson learned. Ms. Daniels just watches him, her expression unreadable. Richard exhales, glancing around. The restaurant no longer feels like his space. The power shifted, and there's nothing he can do about it. Ms. Daniels reaches into her purse, pulls out a crisp bill, and places it gently on the table. A generous tip, far more than necessary. She stands up, adjusting her blouse with the same quiet confidence she's held since the beginning. No rush, no anger, just control. Richard watches her, his pride shattered. His hands clench into fists under the table, but he says nothing. What could he say? She picks up her book, running her fingers over the cover before sliding it into her bag. Then she looks at him, right into his eyes. There's no smugness in her expression. No need to humiliate him further, just truth. Next time, she says softly. Judge less. You never know who you're talking to. The words settle into the air like a final note in a song. The restaurant is silent. No whispers now. No laughter. Just the weight of her words hanging between them. Richard swallows, his throat tight. She gives him one last, knowing look before turning away. Her heels click softly against the floor as she walks toward the exit. The manager nods respectfully as she passes. The waitstaff part to make way for her. She doesn't look back. Richard exhales slowly and sinks into the chair across from him. He stares at the untouched drink on the table. For the first time in a long time, he feels small. No amount of money could buy back the respect he just lost, and he knows it.